The October air was heavy and damp. Inside the stone walls of Newark, there was no chill, only a sticky wetness that clung to everything. Water dripped from the ceiling, the stench of mold mixing with bitter smoke and the sharp reek of sickness. In the depths of the chamber, lit only by the wavering glow of torches, a man twisted on his bed in fits of fever. Every movement was followed by a groan that echoed against the vaults above. His strength was draining away, as though the very fortress was sucking the life from him. He was no nameless soldier, no forgotten prisoner. Before his servants and the few loyal knights who still remained lay the ruler of vast lands, the King of England, Ireland, Normandy, and Aquitaine. A man who once dreamed of surpassing his brother, the legendary Lionheart. Yet in these final hours, there was nothing majestic left. No weapon in hand, no battle cry, no loyal crowds. Only the wasted convulsions of a body burning out and attendants powerless to stop the slow collapse. Outside, silence reigned, but inside the castle, a storm raged. Fever consumed him. His breathing grew shallow and broken. With each gasp, he seemed to shrink, smaller, weaker, as if folding in upon himself. His face was distorted, his eyes lost in a fog. Everything that once inspired fear, his cruelty, his power, his cold disdain for enemies, dissolved into this pitiful spectacle. There were no hymns, no reverence, no bowed heads. Even the walls themselves seemed unwilling to keep the secret of his decline. But it was in this moment that history was being born, a story that would echo for centuries. Because the end of this king was not seen as a private tragedy, but as justice, a reckoning many believed had come from heaven itself. To understand why his fate was judged so deserved, we must return to the very beginning, to the day he entered the world already marked by a curse that would define his life. He was born the last of King Henry II's sons. By the time he arrived, his three elder brothers already held titles, lands, and futures. He had nothing. With a cruel twist of irony, his father gave him a nickname that became his destiny: Lackland. In those days, a name could shape a man's path. For the youngest son, it was a brand he could never escape. From childhood, he hungered for recognition. He watched as his brothers commanded armies and won followers, while he gathered only scraps of attention from his parents. He did not accept it quietly. Inside him grew a fierce, bitter resolve to seize what was not his. To his family, he appeared restless, quick-tempered, sly. When his elder brother Richard left for the crusade, the youngest saw his chance. England, left without its lion protector, became a battlefield of intrigue. He spread rumors of his brother's death, bribed supporters, even courted alliances with the enemies of the crown. He dreamed that if Richard never returned, the crown would fall into his hands at last. And when news arrived that Richard had been captured, instead of rushing to raise ransom, he schemed to keep his brother away as long as possible. It was a betrayal so brazen that even hardened, cynical barons were appalled. Yet when Richard finally returned, he did not punish his brother. He forgave him. For another man, that mercy might have been a chance to change. But for Lackland, it was only another humiliation, another reminder of his insignificance. His ambition did not die. It only hardened. One day he swore he would take what he believed was rightfully his. That day came. In 1199, Richard's sudden death from a stray wound cleared the path the youngest had long dreamed of. At last, the crown of England was his. But with it came a revelation. The clever pretender was one thing, the king another, and soon the world saw what he truly was. In his hands, everything crumbled like sand slipping through his fingers. When the crown was placed upon his head, many hoped for caution, wisdom, at least some effort to secure the fragile legacy he inherited. Instead, power drew out the worst in him. He was no warrior like Richard, unable to strike fear with sword in hand. His only weapons were suspicion and cunning, turned into constant plots and petty intrigues.
In his first years, he faced the French king, Philip II, far more experienced and calculating. Instead of triumphs, England endured humiliating defeats. Years that might have strengthened the crown became a disaster. He lost one possession after another: Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Poitou. Everything his father had built over decades, everything that made the Plantagenets one of Europe's greatest dynasties, slipped away. Chroniclers wrote that people began calling him Soft Sword. The nickname cut almost as deep as Lackland. In an age when kings were expected to lead in battle, weakness on the field was a disgrace no one could wash away. That shame drove him into desperate measures. Losing lands abroad, he tried to compensate at home. But instead of earning respect, he chose the path of oppression. His reign became an age of crushing taxes and endless levies, with favors reserved only for those willing to pay. He drained knights and barons for coin to fund wars he himself blundered away. His greed was never just financial, it became a tool of humiliation. Every demand felt not only like necessity, but like contempt for his subjects. To him, England was no kingdom, but a purse to be emptied. And behind this stood his personal hatred for any who dared resist. Once, he had been a younger son, living in the shadows. Now, wearing the crown, he revealed his true self. Not a protector of his people, but a ruler ready to bleed his own land dry to preserve his pride. The defeats in France and the shame of losing so much land left him with an endless hunger for compensation. He knew that what his ancestors had won could not be restored with words or treaties. So he began to drain England of every coin, every ounce of strength. To his subjects, it felt like suffocation. He introduced new taxes so often that even seasoned knights and barons lost track of what they owed. Instead of military service, he demanded money, and he demanded it more frequently than all his predecessors combined. But taxation was not enough. He found another way to keep his vassals in fear: through their families. Barons he suspected of disloyalty faced not only confiscated lands and crushing fines. The most terrifying punishment was that the king seized their children, turning them into hostages. It was a chain that could not be broken without risking the lives of their own blood. Stories of his cruelty spread across the realm. None was more chilling than the fate of Matilda de Brose. She dared to accuse him openly of murdering his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, the heir who had vanished under mysterious circumstances while in the king's custody. Everyone suspected the boy had not died by accident, but few had the courage to say it aloud. Matilda did, and she paid the price. She and her son were thrown into a dark cell with only a meager supply of food. Days later, the guards opened the chamber to find a nightmare. Both had died of starvation, and chroniclers wrote with horror that in her last madness the mother had bitten into the body of her own child. The tale swept across England, a grim warning that the king never forgave defiance. Even in the harsh world of the Middle Ages, such methods seemed monstrous. Yet this was his style of rule. He wanted to be feared more than loved, convinced that fear was the only true tool of power. But in his intoxication with cruelty, he failed to see the truth, that hatred was rising like water behind a dam, ready to burst and drown him. His greed and suspicion knew no limits. More dangerous still, he dared to challenge the church itself. In the early 12th century, the church was not merely a matter of faith, it was the backbone of society, and Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful men in Europe. Yet the King of England decided even the Pope must bow to his will. The clash began over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. The king demanded his candidate, the Pope insisted on his own. Rome did not remain silent. In 1208, the verdict fell. England was placed under interdict.
No one had ever seen such a thing. The church bells fell silent. Chapels were locked. No services were held. No marriages blessed. No Christian burials allowed. For 6 long years, life in the kingdom seemed stripped of its soul. To the people, it was more than punishment. It was exile from heaven itself, the sense that God had turned his face away from their land. Then came an even heavier blow. In 1209, the king himself was excommunicated. For the medieval world, this was a living death, expulsion from the Christian community. A ruler who had once claimed divine favor was now branded an outcast before all of Europe. His allies wavered, his enemies grew bold, and the common people saw in it the hand of divine judgment. And yet even then he would not bow. He tried to maneuver, to buy time, but every step only widened the gulf between him and his people. His war with the church became proof that he was willing to fight everyone at once, his barons, his neighbors, his own subjects, even God himself. But this war was turning against him. For no king, however mighty, could survive when both earth and heaven were arrayed as enemies. By the second decade of the 13th century, his reign had become a crushing burden for England. He had united against him forces that almost never stood together: barons, clergy, and common folk. No conspiracy was needed. His greed and paranoia were enough. Even those who had sworn loyalty now searched for ways to be rid of him. The barons, ruined by endless taxes, saw themselves treated only as sources of gold and hostages. The clergy could not forgive his defiance of the Pope. The people were exhausted, bled dry by wars that brought only disgrace. By mid-1215, it all erupted into open revolt. One garrison after another, one castle after another, the barons shifted to the rebels' side. By spring, they were ready to act, and marched against their king. And so, on the banks of the Thames at Runnymede, an event took place that few at the time saw as the dawn of a new era, but that would change the course of the world. The barons presented the king with a scroll of demands, a list of grievances and conditions they required before they would obey him. To them, it was an act of desperation, a last attempt to rein in a tyrant. To him, it was an unbearable humiliation. Surrounded by enemies, with scarcely a friend left, he pressed his seal upon the document that would be known as the
To contemporaries, it was only a contract between lords and their ruler. Yet hidden in its clauses were ideas that struck at the very heart of monarchy. No one stands above the law. Taxes require consent. Property cannot be seized at whim. Even weights and measures must be fair and uniform. To him, it was a mark of weakness, forced upon him. To the barons, it was hope, a tool to restrain their king. But none of them could have guessed that this parchment, born of crisis, would become a symbol of liberty for nations not yet even imagined. Even as the ink dried, he was already plotting how to break his word. Deep down, he never accepted a single clause. To him, it was not an agreement, but coercion, and therefore meaningless. He believed crowns were given by God, and no assembly of nobles had the right to tell him how to rule. He turned for support to an unlikely ally, the very Pope Innocent III, with whom he had once fought bitterly. Now he begged for the Magna Carta to be declared void. The Pope agreed, calling the document shameful and forever invalid. For the barons, it was a slap in the face. Their victory, won at such risk and cost, was wiped away. Outrage exploded at once. The barons raised their banners of rebellion and renounced their oaths of loyalty. Civil war, long feared, broke out in full force. And in this storm came an unthinkable step for England. The rebels invited a foreign prince to take the throne. In 1216, Prince Louis, son of the King of France, landed on English shores. His army marched through London as the townsfolk cheered, weary of tyranny. Many welcomed him as a liberator who would end the rule of the hated monarch. King John himself became little more than a fugitive. His power crumbled before his eyes. Allies vanished. Even castles once sworn to him shifted to the enemy's side. It seemed his dynasty was doomed. Too many enemies, too few friends. Even those who once served him out of fear or profit now saw clearly this king brought only ruin. Yet he clung to power like a drowning man to wreckage, and that desperate grip only pulled him closer to the darkest disaster of his life. The summer of 1216 was a season of humiliation. He no longer ruled his kingdom. French troops held London, barons openly served a foreign prince, and though the church had restored him in name, it no longer saw him as the true defender of the faith. Fate appeared to have closed every path, and yet one more episode remained, a loss so symbolic it became the final image of his reign. Marching north with his army, he reached the treacherous estuary of the Wash. It was a place infamous for shifting sands and sudden tides. Crossing was possible only in a narrow window of time, only for those bold or foolish enough to risk it. The king with a portion of his men made it across, but behind him came the baggage train, heavy wagons drawn by horses, laden with treasure, coin, plunder, and the crown jewels themselves, including the legendary crown of Alfred the Great.
As the wagons moved into the flats, nature struck. The tide surged in without warning. The sands began to swallow wheels. Soldiers struggled to haul the treasure forward, but the waters rose too fast. Horses, men, and chests sank beneath the waves. In minutes, the wealth he had hoarded through taxes and threats was gone, buried in the sea. Never had royal power looked so helpless. What symbolized the might of his dynasty disappeared into muddy waters, as if nature itself had stripped him of the last proof of greatness. To contemporaries, it was more than a material loss, it was a parable of his reign. Everything he had seized by force slipped away like sand through his fingers. That disaster broke him. Not even his pride could conceal defeat. The man who stood before his army was no longer a king, but a ruined figure, stripped of treasure, abandoned by allies, drained of strength. He moved on, but it was no longer a king's march. It was the weary trudge of a man whose every step brought him closer to the end. After the catastrophe of the Wash, he no longer appeared a sovereign. His progress was more like flight than campaign. Bereft of riches and confidence, he traveled toward Swineshead Abbey, perhaps hoping for a moment of rest. But there he made the fatal mistake that sealed his fate. Within the abbey walls, he indulged himself in a feast, as though to prove he could still taste life. Chroniclers disagree on what lay on the table. Some wrote of peaches and cider, others of pears and strong ale. Whatever the fare, for his weakened body it was too much, too heavy, too greedy, too ill-timed. That very night the fever took hold. Pain gripped him, spasms racked his body, robbing him of rest. What seemed at first like indigestion became torment. Chroniclers wrote of his bowels consumed, destroyed from within.
Hour by hour it worsened. His skin burned, his head swam, until even his attendants could see their king was undone. He could continue only in a litter, borne by soldiers and servants across roads and rivers, every jolt sending fresh agony through him. The man who once decided the fate of thousands now depended on whether common men could carry him one step further. Each day he lost not only strength, but the last fragments of dignity. It was a march toward the inevitable. No armies trailed behind him, no trumpets sounded, only anxious glances, the stench of sickness, and the awareness that his world was collapsing.
When his litter reached the gates of Newark Castle, all knew it was not a king's arrival, but the return of a doomed man to the last walls still loyal to him. The fortress took him in, but it could not hide the truth. Before his servants lay a figure wasted, broken, emptied of grandeur. Inside, silence reigned. He could no longer sit the throne or give commands. His body was failing. From his bed he slipped in and out of consciousness, dictating scraps of his will. Who would inherit what little lands remained? Who would succeed him? For moments he tried to act as king, but the sickness always returned, reducing him again to spasms and sweat. He named as heir his 9-year-old son, a boy called Henry. It was not only a last attempt to save the dynasty, but an acknowledgement that his own life was ending. In brief words of confession, he admitted mistakes and begged forgiveness. But who could believe those he had tormented would forget? Before his eyes must have risen the faces of hostages who starved, barons crushed by taxes, a nephew whose fate remained a mystery. Beyond the castle walls, England was already imagining life without him. To the barons, he was a tyrant. To the people, a source of misery. To the church, a ruler who had shamed the faith. Even the knights at his bedside knew his power had vanished. All that remained was to wait for the end. Chroniclers would later write that his body seemed to tear itself apart from the poison of his own life. But for his contemporaries, the details of the sickness mattered less than the simple fact of his decline. His death was seen as justice, a reckoning ordained by Providence. In the royal chambers of Newark, it was not a dynasty that ended, but one of the darkest chapters in England's history. The night he finally passed was marked by no mourning crowds, no solemn processions. It was a quiet moment, almost ordinary, yet for those who had watched his life, it confirmed the belief that the world had been freed of a tyrant. Chroniclers described his last hours with rare candor, almost glee, as if delighted to show that the end of the man who held England in fear was as pitiful as his reign itself. And yet, strangely, his death saved the realm. When his 9-year-old son Henry was hastily crowned at Gloucester, men who had so recently fought against the crown gathered around the boy. A child in royal robes carried no threat, no hatred, none of the bitterness his father inspired. For the barons, it was a chance to start anew, to rule in the name of a young king without enduring humiliation. One man proved decisive, William Marshal. The aged knight, veteran of countless battles and still revered as a model of honor, took on the guardianship of the boy king. He knew that without firm guidance, the country would plunge back into chaos, and he acted swiftly. One of his first acts was to reissue the charter, but in a different form. The most radical clauses were cut, but the essentials remained: limits on arbitrary power, protection of property, fair justice.
And so the document the tyrant had tried to erase became the very foundation of reconciliation. The barons saw their demands acknowledged, the church accepted the legitimacy of the new reign, and the common people gained at least a glimmer of hope. Even Prince Louis of France, who had been hailed as a savior, quickly lost support. Why follow a foreigner when they now had a young monarch and a charter promising order? This was the great paradox. By his life, John had destroyed faith in the crown, but by his death, he gave it the chance to be reborn. His son, too young to grasp politics,
became the symbol of a new hope for a nation exhausted by war and tyranny. After John's passing, it seemed as though England itself exhaled in relief. The Civil War was not yet over, but the fury drained away. The barons who had risen in rebellion now had what they wanted: a king untainted by the hatred of the past, and a charter securing their rights. There was no reason left to support the French prince. Louis, once greeted as a would-be king, became a foreign intruder, unwanted and unnecessary. His forces dwindled, and with them his claim to the throne. William Marshal proved astonishingly shrewd. He not only kept young Henry on the throne, but turned defeat into a moral victory. Under his guidance, the charter was reborn. Even in its softened form, its meaning endured. From now on, even the king must remember he stands not above the law. First imposed by force, the principle began to take root as tradition. To contemporaries, it seemed like the return of order. Men who'd fought on the battlefield now swore oaths of loyalty to a child sovereign. It looked as if the darkness of the old reign had vanished with its tyrant. But in truth, something far greater had begun. For it was after these events that the charter ceased to be a temporary compromise and slowly became the foundation of England's political life. With every new generation, the charter gained fresh power. It was confirmed, revised, shortened, but never forgotten. What in 1215 had been merely an agreement with barons slowly became a symbol, reminding all that even the greatest power is not eternal, and above every throne stands the law. Thus ended one of the darkest chapters of the dynasty, and began a story whose echoes would be heard not only in England, but far beyond. Time passed, and the charter, born as a reluctant concession, turned into something far greater than its authors ever imagined. Each time a new monarch sought recognition or the loyalty of his nobles, he was forced to confirm it again. With each repetition, the text became more than a legal record. It became a living reminder that authority has limits.
In the 13th century, it was read and rewritten dozens of times. Sometimes this was done for political gain, sometimes to pacify unrest, but every reaffirmation strengthened its weight. Slowly, its meaning spread beyond the barons. The ideas that no one should be punished without trial, that taxation required consent, became seen as the foundation of justice for all. Centuries passed, and every new crisis only gave the charter greater force. In the 17th century, when Parliament clashed with the Stuart kings, lawyers and orators raised it as a banner. They argued that since the 13th century the monarchy had been bound by law, and therefore the king must obey the same rules as his subjects. These words became weapons in the struggle for constitutional monarchy. Another century later, across the ocean, settlers in America remembered the charter as they declared independence. To them, it proved that freedom and justice were not privileges, but rights rooted in the deep past. Thomas Jefferson himself drew on it when he wrote of rights that cannot be taken away. Even in the 20th century, as the world tried to recover from global wars, its spirit lived on. The same principles shaped international declarations of human rights. Power must be limited, personal freedoms must be protected. From the parchment sealed under duress at Runnymede, stretched a line to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted 7 centuries later. Thus, a document born in humiliation became a symbol of liberty. And therein lies the greatest irony. The king who tried to destroy it ensured his name would live forever through it. By the 13th century, the Magna Carta was no longer a mere bargain. Each monarch, in search of legitimacy, had to confirm it anew.
What began as a peace settlement became a permanent reminder that even a crown is not above the law. With every decade, its authority grew. It was copied, reduced, reaffirmed, each time returning stronger. From a list of grievances, it evolved into a foundation of restrained power. In the 17th century, when Parliament rose against the Stuarts, jurists held it aloft like a banner from the depths of time. It became a weapon against royal absolutism, and in the 18th century, when the American colonies broke from the British crown, its principles rang out across the Atlantic. Jefferson himself invoked it, declaring that human rights are inalienable.
Thus, the parchment signed under pressure at Runnymede began a journey that carried it far beyond medieval England. And in that lies the bitter irony. The king who saw the charter as humiliation made it an eternal symbol of freedom. The centuries rolled on, and the charter never disappeared into archives. Each crisis gave it new life. In 17th century England, lawyers and parliamentarians pointed to it as proof. The king must obey the law like any subject. These words became the foundation of resistance to absolute monarchy. John did not enter memory as a hero, but as a warning. His nickname, Lackland, was no accident. He lost everything: the French domains, the loyalty of his barons, the support of the church, his treasures, his dignity. Chroniclers wrote of him with contempt, and the people remembered him as a villain for centuries. Even the legend of Robin Hood cast him forever as the embodiment of greed and treachery. From that time on, the name John vanished from the list of English kings, a mark of disgrace never to be repeated. And yet it was this despised monarch who became the unwilling father of the idea that no one stands above the law. So the worst of kings left the greatest of legacies. His life remains a reminder. Tyranny crumbles, but freedom is born even in the shadow of the darkest reigns.